Today's read aloud is called The Village of Lights. We're talking today about symbolism, how one thing can symbolize something else. And I believe we did a couple mini lessons on that a few weeks ago in reading workshop, but we're coming back to it with this as well. And talking about how light can symbolize hope, promise of better days to come, of better things to come, kind of a light in the darkness type of thing. And when you look at this book, you can really see the light standing out the way the illustrator has done those paintings. So, The Village of Lights, written by Mitchell Stevens and illustrated by Emily Hurst Pritchett. I think that the dedication is very telling to us, kind of the theme of the story and where it's coming from. It says, for Steve, Rick, and refugees everywhere. So we can get the idea that there's going to be something to do with refugees. We might be thinking historical fiction already, and we're definitely thinking that that would be the context for needing some hope in the darkness. A long time ago, on top of a hill overlooking a village in far-off England, there lived a lonely old farmer. Now it must be said that the old farmer hadn't always been lonely. He hadn't always been old. In fact, there had been a time in his younger years that his humble farm had been filled with the sweet laughter of children and the voice of a loving wife. Back then, the old farmer's wife would often chase the squealing children around the yard at sunset, while the old farmer finished his labors and set supper on the table, smiling as he listened to the sounds of their joy. The family would gather around the big oak table for supper and story time. The old farmer and his wife would captivate their children with tales of love and bravery. Then the family would lie down to sleep for the night, their stomachs filled with food and their dreams filled with courageous characters. But all that was gone now. The old farmer's wife had passed from a tragic illness many years ago. His children had all grown and moved away, and all that remained were the memories of a happier time. Each night, after finishing the last of his chores, the old man would perch himself on his broken-down fence and gaze down at the twinkling lights of the frosty village. Hundreds of flickering lights from the shops and homes would wink back at him like old friends through the blackness of night, kind of symbolizing that hopefulness of those memories in the darkness of night. There's that light in the darkness. Occasionally, the sound of a dog barking in the distance would disturb the silence. At other times, quiet conversations of families enjoying a final exchange before turning in for the night would escape into the cold night air and fill the old farmer's heart with warm memories of days gone by. And for that one brief moment, enveloped by familiar lights and sounds of his village, he would forget his loneliness. He would feel hopeful, right? Optimistic. That's, again, that light shining through. Ooh, I did it right there, symbolism. Night after night, the old farmer would remain fixed at his spot on the hill until every light of the village had been extinguished. First one light would disappear, followed by another, and then another. Finally, the light on the church steeple would be the last light of the village, shining triumphantly against the night sky. And then it too would go out, putting the village to bed beneath a blanket of darkness. So then it becomes the absence of hope, the darkness and the loneliness of night. One chilly morning, the old farmer made his way into town to pay a visit to the village cobbler. His favorite boots had worn thin and were in great need of repair. A cobbler would be a person who fixed shoes or made shoes. As the old farmer entered the shop, the cobbler lifted a silencing hand and motioned for the old farmer to listen to the nearby radio. As he did, a somber voice on the radio declared, and that, consequently, this country is at war with Germany. So this tells us war. For a brief moment, the cobbler and the old farmer didn't say a word, instead exchanging grave looks of concern. Whatever are we to do? The cobbler finally exclaimed as he cradled his head in his hands. The voice on the radio continued to warn that German warplanes would soon begin their bombing raids over the towns and villages of England, and the more the old farmer listened, the heavier his heart grew. News that the war had reached the shores of his beloved homeland made him very sad indeed. Over the next few days, villagers were taught what they needed to do to protect their village. They were told to hang thick black curtains in every window of every home in order to block out any light that might be seen by enemy planes. The mayor ordered that all streetlights and lamps be extinguished. Do you see how they're putting out the light, putting out the hope as well as time is going? The mayor ordered that all the streetlights and lamps be extinguished. All throughout the village, people could be seen nervously scurrying about, preparing their homes and neighborhoods. Windows were blacked out, and bulbs of every size and shape were removed from street lamps. The discarded light bulbs were then put into wooden crates that had been placed in the streets throughout the village. Wishing to do his part, the old farmer slowly pushed his wooden cart through the narrow streets of the village to gather up lights, feeling that in doing so, he was gathering up old friends. He sadly filled his cart with crates full of lights and then pulled his cart up the snow-packed hill to his farm. One by one, he lifted the crates out of his cart and carefully placed them in the corner of his barn. There he felt they would be safe until the war was over and they could once again light up the village. As the days and weeks passed by, the Christmas season quietly approached. The village, which at this time of year was typically glowing with beautiful lights and sounds of Christmas, was instead shrouded over with the dark veil of war. The old farmer had long ago stopped sitting at the post of his fence at night because there was nothing to see. All the lights that had once beamed up at him so brightly were now hidden away in fear, that absence of hope, the fearfulness, the absence of light representing that absence of hope. Instead, the old man would go to bed each night feeling a little bit lonelier than he had the night before. One night, as the old farmer finished his chores and leaned his shovel against the wall of his barn before heading to bed, he caught the sight of crates of lights. It seemed so long ago that they had lit up the village. Oh, how he missed them. After the farmer had crawled into bed that night and was just about ready to drop off to sleep, a tiny idea popped into his head. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that it was exactly what he needed to do. Yes, he said to himself, whispering even though no one was in his quiet house to overhear him. With a small smile and a new sense of purpose, he fell into a deep and peaceful slumber. As Christmas Eve arrived and the nightly darkness once more settled over the village, the villagers, who should have been waiting and listening for St. Nick, were instead greeted with the unsettling buzz of approaching enemy planes. Before too long, the loud thunder of exploding bombs in distant villages shook the ground under their feet, sending them scurrying for cover. Closer and closer the planes came until suddenly their screaming engines could be heard just overhead. Frightened, the people of the village huddled together with their families in the darkened homes and shelters. The noise of the circling planes above the village was deafening. Silently they waited as plane after plane flew over their village. Finally, after what seemed like hours, a quiet silence settled over the village as the last of the planes roared off into the distance. When the villagers were sure that the planes were really gone and that it was finally safe to come out, they cautiously filed out into the cold night. As they gathered in the village streets, one young boy noticed an unfamiliar glow coming from the hill where the old farmer lived. "What's that?" he cried, pointing up at the hill. Are you thinking what I'm thinking about what the farmer has done? When the people of the village turned to look at where the young boy was pointing, their eyes were met with a glorious sight. For there on the hill beneath the old farmer's barn were strings and strings of lights in every shape and size, spelling out a brilliant message for all to see. Peace. Yes, peace. Peace on earth, some of the villagers whispered to each other as they gazed upon the heavenly sight, their eyes shining with light. Never had the lights of Christmas meant so much to the people of the village as they did at this very moment. And it must be said that never had the lights of the village meant so very much to the old farmer, who, by the way, was no longer lonely, but all the people that have come up to visit. Well, with the absence of light, we have fear. With the presence of light, we have hopefulness, optimism. bravery, courage. Those are all things that light can represent. So I want you to think about that as you go into answering your exit slip questions today. And then also be thinking about at this holiday season, whichever holiday your family celebrates, there are lights associated with that. Lights of hope in the Jewish tradition, lights of hope in the Christian traditions as well. So be thinking about those stars and those candles and those lights and the hope that they represent in this holiday season. I know you're going to do a great job with that, and when you're done, please take some time to do some good reading. It's important that you feed your brain some good adventures and some good stories. And I'll talk to you tomorrow.